Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Dr. Alex. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that is something I get really geeky about and I'm so excited about. I'm even actually working on a PhD in organizational development and change and how leadership plays into that, specifically for those of us who are practitioner healthcare entrepreneurs. So I'll share more about that as we go. But what we're talking about today is really this thread of leadership that I introduced in the last episode and how we have this internal world of leadership and then the external world of leadership. And it's both how we lead ourselves and how we lead others. And I know for me, it was a huge challenge as I built my practice and built a team, and also in how I led my patients and showed up as a practitioner. I think one of the first places we get challenged is when we first get out and start practicing and have these people coming to us looking for answers, right? They want us to tell them what to do or whatever your dynamic is as a healthcare practitioner. It feels uncomfortable. And there's this level of growth that we all have to go through in becoming a leader in the health space, in our business, in all of those. There's always going to be a learning curve. And what I have learned over the years is that we all have kind of these natural given strengths and ways of approaching leadership and our lives that are somewhat some of them are like just a core part of us. And some of them are things that we can develop or, will shift over time. And I remember very clearly the first time I really had this aha moment about this. I After I'd gone through all of my burnout, someone mentioned a book to me and I love to read. Obviously, I'm doing a PhD, so I really love to read. Um, and it was called The Six Types of Working Genius by Pat Lencioni. I have no connection or affiliation with them at all, but what his organization called the Table Group had kind of figured out, he was always grumpy at work, like just hated work. And I could relate because there was a time when managing a team, I was always grumpy at work. But they essentially distilled work, this concept of work and what needs to happen for any kind of work to get done, down to 6 steps. And those 6 steps are someone has to wonder, they have to ask the question, I wonder about this. And then someone comes in and it says, with invention, and it says, hey, here's a way that we could, solve this. Here's an idea for this. And then discernment comes in and says, this is a good idea or this is a bad idea. Once that we're through that, galvanizing comes in and motivates everybody and gets everyone excited and gung ho about the thing. And then we have what they call enablers, but they're the people who are they're really good at teamwork. Like they come in, they're really excited about just helping put something together and supporting the team around it. And then there's tenacity, which is required to finish the thing and get the results that you're trying to get. And so these are the kind of the 6 parts of work. And what they realized is that all of us have 2 of those that are in our zone of genius. So that's where time stands still and life just flows and we're excited and we love doing it and we could do it all day long and it doesn't feel like work, right? And then 2 of those are in our zone of competence where it's kind of energy neutral, but it can still lead to burnout over time. And then 2 of those are in our zone of frustration where it literally sucks the life energy out of you. And what we don't do, this is kind of a new way of looking at this, because we don't typically look at work or design work around concepts of where we show up best and where our energy flows or what our unique genius and strengths are. There's more that we're going to build on with strengths. I'm kind of going to throw a lot at you this episode. But we tend to create what the position is supposed to look like according to someone somewhere and then try to fill into those shoes. And one thing I can remember from my own journey is somewhat early on, because I built such a big team, so somewhat early on in my practice journey, I started looking outside of the realm of health profession practice management and went to things like a leadership seminar. So I went to something called Next Level Leadership with Chris Licurdo in Tennessee, and he teaches and is very big on DISC profiling. So, DISC is one way it's somewhat a personality test, somewhat a strength test, but a little different from the working genius that I was just talking about. And according to my DISC profile and my strengths on my DISC, being an entrepreneur is not something I should be good at. And I always was rubbed a little off by that because I'm not a driver, right? I don't have the like go get it, the typical white guy in a suit in the boardroom who's really like just to the point and like, let's get this done and do it. And that falls more into that realm of tenacity. And that's not my natural state of being. So for a long time, I judged myself, honestly, and came up with this story that I wasn't naturally inclined towards business ownership and leadership in that way. And so I needed to push myself to be different. And when I read this book on the 6 types of working genius, what I realized is that whole befuddled conversation, we'll call it, led to me actually leading my team in particular. I was spending a lot of time in my zone of competence and my zone of frustration. So tenacity and galvanizing are in my zone of frustration. Like, hey, I hate it. It gives me the will. And things fall into that, like marketing and definitely leading a team and getting everybody on board with doing something and making sure stuff gets done. So I found I was micromanaging constantly and I didn't know how to step back. And it took me a very long time to finally understand what a uh, office manager was and what their role was supposed to be in terms of taking a lot of that on. And so my zone of genius is actually in invention and discernment, which leans that I'm a very creative person. And one of the downfalls of that is I create a lot, I build a lot, I have a lot of ideas. I just follow through can be a problem because galvanizing and tenacity are not in my zone of genius. They're my zone of frustration. And so I found that how I led and did a lot of my job in my practice wasn't actually allowing myself to be in my zone of genius at all. I think the only place that really showed up was maybe with patient care and being really fluid and creative and unique with how I did that and how I approached the person and the adjustment and all of that. Like it showed up in how I interacted with my patients. But there was this whole side called business ownership where it wasn't showing up at all. And so I had this aha moment where I was like, no wonder why I burned out. And that kind of planted the seed for me to start thinking about what if the answer isn't in that we have to be a certain type of person or a certain way in order to have entrepreneurial success? Because I'm not the only one that, I'm also a woman. And so I think that's part of it. Like all of us are kind of wired differently in terms of how we lead, how we show up, and how we do that. And so it's about two things. I mean, we want to grow and develop, absolutely. And part of that is to acknowledge what your unique strengths that don't ever really change are. So creativity it shows up as the first thing on my via character strengths, which is another thing I'm going to talk about. It shows up as the first thing in my working genius. It shows up in just about everything. And it's not something I ever gave myself permission to really embrace until now. And so I found ways to allow this because I'm not a gifted artist. I mean, I play the violin and there's other things, but it's not like I can draw or have, these skills. It's just that my brain functions in a very creative way. So I can think through things in high level and because I have discernment, they tend to be good ideas. So why I'm sharing all of this is what we're talking about today is this world of leadership, both the inner world and then the outer world that we express. When we come into conflict with that, like our inner world of leadership looks a lot different than the version that we're showing up at work with, we burn out because there's this unequal energy exchange where something is sucking us dry. And so when you can start to do this inner world work of really getting to know and understand yourself as a leader and what your strengths really are, what you actually bring to the table, how we design our businesses and the roles within them, it becomes really different. Because in an ideal world, we have someone working for us whose genius is in the things that ours is not. And then we can create our role to be something where we can show up differently and lead in a way that's congruent and authentic to ourselves. I don't know if you can raise your hand and feeling like there's aspects of owning and therefore leading your practice that feel really like, ugh, like inauthentic and gross, and like you're really pushing yourself to be somebody that you're actually not. And it's just draining. It's exhausting. And I remember struggling to, I kept feeling like I had to be a certain way with my staff and all of that, and judging myself for the things that actually came to me really naturally, because I thought there was no place for that in leadership and in practice. So I want to introduce you to a couple of things because I got really interested in this. And so I've actually done some research. I shared I'm working on a PhD that delves into some of this as well. But one of the things I've become interested in is this concept of there's an umbrella term called positive leadership. And so positive leadership is leadership that is driven by our own individual strengths and that works to better the people around us and motivate the people around us. And typically is moving towards some sort of positive change, but it's going to be a little bit outside the box because it's driven by your personal strengths. And so there's still room to grow within that, but it starts with identifying what those actually are and then translating that into your practice. So I shared, a few of where these things came up for me and introduced the working genius, which is one concept that I was like, huh, when I really stopped to think about it, this is a big shift and would completely alter how I approached practice and has since I've come back into practice. I do things a whole lot differently than I did the first time around, where I felt like I had to be a certain person. And rather now I can embrace who I really am and still allow room for growth in there. So I want to give you some resources because there's a lot of directions you can go with this and a lot of depth. So one of them is Working Genius, which you can go to workinggenius.com. They have a $25 assessment. It's worth it. We'll just say that. I don't get anything from that, but it will walk you through a short assessment and then pretty quickly help you figure out, because I can read about and think about these things, but it was helpful for me to actually take the test and have something generate and say like, here's what you are. And then me to step back and realize, oh, okay. So that's really me. And I was leading my whole team from my zone of competence where I was trying to be everybody's friend and didn't have any boundaries. And, there was a lot to unpack in there. And then I'd freak out and go into my zone of frustration, but I never really had any time in my zone of genius. So that's number one. The second is something called VIA character strength. So it's VIA is the acronym, but they're known as values in action. And so this is something that comes out of the world of positive psychology, which is a discipline that I got a master's degree in somewhat recently. And that really opened my eyes to a lot of this stuff. And so the VIA character strengths are based on the idea that there's about 24 strengths that they distilled down, that we have within us. And so we'll have our top five. They can shift a little bit. I've retaken it a few times. And so this is something that can be fluid with your growth. But I found that there are a couple that are just like the things that never go away. They're always going to be in your top five. And so it can be helpful to identify what those are, because you can train and develop other things, but those top one or two that constantly show up in your top five are always going to be there. And so it can be helpful to know that, i.e., creativity for me. And yours could be something totally different. And that's totally fine because this is about you. And so then the next piece of that is figuring out and starting to work through, how does this translate into practice, into your business and your practice? Like, where do you show up inside of your strengths? And where are you not? And where are you pushing to be something that you're not, or stuck in feeling like you have to be in your zone of frustration or whatever that is. And so to navigate that is like way too much to unpack on a podcast. But to navigate that, I actually have a very in-depth workshop that I created and recorded for, it was originally for chiropractors, but it relates to all health practitioner owners, health practice owners, healthcare practice owners, in that it walks you through understanding on a much deeper level, like what positive leadership really means and how it might apply to you and your practice and what you want to do with it. And then getting into your VIA character strengths and your working genius and figuring out where all those things need to apply. If any of you have taken the leadership energy audit that I've created, This isn't like an added layer to that, right? Because you can take those different aspects of your practice that we look at, like your team relationships and systems and all of that stuff, and start to apply some of this. Like, is this sucking my energy dry because it's the vampire of I'm in my zone of frustration, or is this the thing that really lifts me up and inspires me and makes me more excited? And it's not that we're never going to do work that's not in our zone of genius, but we want to ultimately spend more of our time, if we can, in those things that really drive our energy and doing the tasks and doing the work that really drives our energy and fulfills us, because that is part of how we have this business that functions without us burning out. So all of that is in this workshop that I created called Aligned Authority. And as a podcast listener, I'll give you a code you can go to. There's links to all of this stuff in the show notes. My goal is to make all of this accessible and affordable. So that's like a 4-hour experience if you really want to go on a bit of a deeper dive. You don't want to piecemeal together the two things I talked about and you want a little more direction. That would be where I would go next. So you go to rootedpractice.co/aligned, and that will take you to all of that information. And if you enter the code podcast, you'll get a significant discount. Significant, right? Like lots. And then the last thing is, if you need more than just self-directedness, this is a lot of what I do. I shared my genius is in invention and discernment. And one of the things I'm really good at is helping other people navigate how you implement all of this stuff. So if that's you, I have a connect call that we can jump on. There's zero pressure. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm just here to help you figure out what your next steps are and where you go with this. If you're at a stage of your life where you have the capacity to take on really unpacking some of this stuff for yourself, and if you're feeling burned out and all that stuff, I invite you to create the space so that you can do that. And we all have to reach that capacity in ourselves. So this is like a really high level introduction to what this concept of inside out leadership looks like. Because when we understand ourselves from the inside and how we lead ourselves naturally and what our strengths really are there, then we can start to build that outer picture of leadership that isn't based on what someone says you're supposed to be or how you're supposed to show up or how you're supposed to do things, but is really actually driven by who you really are and what feels good to you and how you want to portray that in the world and how you can use that to expand and grow and foster your own business creation. So it all comes together in this really cool way. And it's a lot to navigate and figure out and unpack. So there's a whole bunch of links in the show notes that are different resources where you can either self-direct and piecemeal this stuff together, or maybe you want to read a book or any of that, and all of that is welcome. The VIA character strengths assessment is free. The Working Genius one is $25, totally worth it, in my opinion. And then you have access to the workshop that I've put together if you want to go a little more in depth and specifically translate this stuff into the world of the health practice, because part of why I'm working on a PhD is that I feel like a lot of the more traditional business stuff is hard to apply for us in an industry that's really different and has a lot of red tape. So that's part of what I've tried to start to distill for us in this pillar of leadership. And then your last option is, hey, let's just jump on a call and talk about some of this stuff, talk through it. Maybe you need to just think with somebody out loud. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to work together, but I'm here to help support you in whatever that looks like. So you have all of those things. I hope this sparked some curiosity, or maybe got you thinking. My goal here is to give you some information, but really spark your interest to start to delve into some of these things for yourself. And with that, we will see you in 2 weeks on the next episode.